In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt dishonorably discharged an entire battalion of heroic black soldiers without a trial. They were accused of a crime they didn't commit, and their refusal to lie was called a conspiracy of silence. So what actually happened? Mingo Sanders was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1857. As a boy, he'd watched a military parade march through his hometown, the drummer's cadence echoing off the cobblestones, the soldiers moving as one. He decided then he would be a soldier. On May the 16th, 1881, at 24 years old, Sanders enlisted in the United States Army. He was assigned to the 25th Infantry Regiment, one of 4 all-black units created after the Civil War, led by white officers, sent to the most isolated corners of the American West. The Buffalo Soldiers, Native Americans supposedly called them, seeing something familiar in their dark skin and tightly curled hair. These men built forts, strung telegraph lines, fought in the Indian Wars, and did the brutal work white regiments avoided. They deserted less, complained less, and asked for nothing but the respect their service earned. Sanders would spend his entire career with the 25th Infantry. He would give them everything. In 1888, Sanders arrived at Fort Missoula, Montana, with Company B. The town welcomed the black soldiers, a rare thing in 1880s America. They weren't just tolerated, they were respected. Sanders played on the fort's baseball team. He married a woman named Luella Branch. He rose through the ranks to First Sergeant, the highest position available to an enlisted man. When a young white lieutenant named James Moss proposed an experimental mission in 1896, Sanders was among the first to volunteer. Lieutenant Moss wanted to prove that bicycles could move troops faster than horses. The 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps was born. 20 black soldiers, 3 white officers, riding modified Spalding bicycles with steel rims and reinforced frames. Each bike carried 80 pounds of gear, tents, bedrolls, rations, rifle, ammunition. The riders would test the bicycles first on a trip through Yellowstone, then on something far more ambitious. On June 14, 1897, Sanders and 19 other soldiers departed Fort Missoula for St. Louis, Missouri, 1,900 miles across mountains, plains, and prairies. 41 days. Sanders, at 39, was the oldest rider and acting first sergeant of the Corps. He would be the backbone. They crossed the Continental Divide through summer snow. They waded through the Little Big Horn River, carrying their bicycles on their shoulders. They camped at the spot where Custer fell 21 years earlier. In Montana, newspapers barely mentioned their race. In Wyoming, the weather nearly killed them. Exhaustion and low visibility left them lost in a storm. In Nebraska, extreme heat and poisoned water made them sick, the alkali turning their stomachs inside out. But Sanders kept them moving, kept their spirits high, kept the mission alive. Missouri was different. The further east they traveled, the colder the reception. A farmer asked if they were Union soldiers. When told yes, he said, "Then you can pile right off this land." Someone from his house shouted they could camp below the pigsty. This was the America Sanders had been fighting for. On July 24, 1897, they rode into St. Louis. Nearly 1,000 cyclists met them at the city limits, escorting them through cheering crowds to Forest Park. They'd covered 1,900 miles in 41 days, averaging 56 miles per day at 6 miles per hour. "The most marvelous cycling trip in the history of the wheel," declared the St. Louis Star, "and the most rapid military march on record." Sanders and his men had proven their point. The army stopped caring almost immediately. But there was no time to rest. War with Spain erupted in spring 1898, and the 25th Infantry was among the first units mobilized. Sanders found himself on a transport ship to Cuba, headed for the campaign that would make Theodore Roosevelt a national hero. The Spanish dug in at El Caney, a fortified position threatening American forces. On July 1, 1898, the 25th Infantry assaulted the position under withering fire. Sanders was hit. Shrapnel from an explosion tore into his face, partially blinding him. But the 25th took El Caney, relieving pressure on Roosevelt's Rough Riders and the 10th Cavalry's Buffalo Soldiers, who together captured San Juan Hill. During the campaign, Sanders encountered Colonel Roosevelt. The Rough Riders were short on supplies. Sanders shared his unit's rations, hardtack and bacon, with Roosevelt's men. Roosevelt wouldn't forget that sergeant from South Carolina, but he wouldn't remember him the way Sanders hoped. After Cuba, Sanders served in the Philippines, continuing to earn commendations from his commanding officers. By 1906, he'd given 25 years to the Army. He was 2 years from retirement, 2 years from the pension that would secure his future. His record was spotless. Brigadier General Andrew S. Burt called him a sergeant with character excellent, and said he was the best non-commissioned officer I have ever known. That July, the 25th Infantry's 1st Battalion was ordered to Fort Brown, just outside Brownsville, Texas. The town of 6,000 sat on the Mexican border in Cameron County. It was segregated by law, divided by custom, and poisoned by hate. When word came that black soldiers were coming, Anglo and Mexican residents alike reacted with horror. They didn't want the 25th Infantry in their town. They would find a way to remove them. Companies B and C arrived on July 28, 1906. Sanders commanded Company B. From day one, the soldiers faced abuse. They couldn't drink at the 3 bars run by white residents. Customs inspectors physically assaulted them. Store owners refused their business. The hostility was palpable, dangerous, building toward something terrible. On August 12th, a rumor spread. A black soldier had attacked a white woman. The allegation was never proven, but it didn't matter. The town was ready to explode. Major Charles Penrose, the battalion's white commander, consulted with Mayor Frederick Combe. They agreed on an early curfew for August 13th to prevent trouble. All soldiers were ordered to remain in their barracks after taps. Shortly after midnight on August 14th, gunfire erupted in Brownsville. Shots tore through the darkness for 10 to 15 minutes. When it ended, Frank Natus, a white bartender, was dead. Police Lieutenant M.Y. Dominguez lay wounded in the street. The town instantly blamed the black soldiers. Major Penrose was awakened by the sound of gunfire. He immediately ordered a roll call. Every soldier was present. He inspected every rifle. None had been fired. He counted every cartridge. None were missing. His officers confirmed it. The soldiers had been in their barracks. The evidence was clear. Whoever shot up Brownsville, it wasn't the men of the 25th Infantry. The town didn't care about evidence. A citizens' committee formed that morning, headed by retired Army Captain William Kelly. Before their investigation even began, they'd already reached their conclusion. Their interviews started with the same question. State what you know about this attack of the Negroes on this town. They produced spent Army rifle cartridges found in the streets, claiming they proved the soldiers' guilt. No one questioned how those cartridges got there. No one asked why spent shells were conveniently scattered around town, but none were found inside the fort. No one wondered why the timing was too perfect, the evidence too convenient. Major Augustus Bloxham arrived to investigate. He found no proof that any soldier participated in the shooting. The physical evidence contradicted the town's story. Guard duty rosters made it nearly impossible for anyone to have left the post unnoticed. But Bloxham recommended that if the soldiers refused to identify the guilty parties, they should all be discharged, every single one of them. The soldiers were interrogated, pressured, threatened. Name the men who did this, they were told, or you'll all pay the price. To a man, they insisted on their innocence. They had no names to give because they'd done nothing wrong. But their honor, their refusal to lie, would be twisted into evidence of guilt. Texas Ranger Captain William McDonald arrived, the man famous for coining the phrase, "one riot, one ranger." He investigated 12 enlisted men, building a case for conspiracy. A Cameron County grand jury reviewed his evidence. They returned 0 indictments. Even a Texas court in 1906 couldn't find grounds to charge these men. But in Washington, Inspector General Ernest Garlington had already made up his mind. The soldiers' refusal to name the guilty parties proved a conspiracy of silence, he declared. Without a shred of evidence that any soldier fired a shot, Garlington recommended they all be discharged without honor. President Theodore Roosevelt agreed. Roosevelt didn't act immediately. He waited until after the congressional elections in November 1906. The Republican Party needed black voters in the North, and Roosevelt knew this decision would enrage them. So he delayed, waited until the votes were counted, until the political cost was minimized. Then, on November 9th, 1906, he signed Special Order Number 266. 167 soldiers of the 25th Infantry Regiment were discharged without honor. No court-martial, no trial, no chance to defend themselves, no confronting their accusers, no cross-examination of witnesses. The Constitution guaranteed due process of law. Roosevelt denied it to every one of them. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders was the highest-ranking soldier discharged. At 49 years old, with 25 years of service, he lost everything: his career, his pension, his honor, his future. Men with 20 years of service, men within months of retirement, men who'd fought for this country in 3 wars, all destroyed by one order from the man Sanders had shared his rations with in Cuba. The black community erupted. They'd supported Roosevelt, trusted him, celebrated when he invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. Now they felt betrayed. Washington himself pleaded with Roosevelt to reconsider. Roosevelt refused. Mary Church Terrell, the prominent civil rights activist, took up Sanders' cause. With her help, Sanders was allowed to re-enlist on December 12, 1906, but without his rank, without his pension, without acknowledgement that any wrong had been done. One man refused to let this injustice stand: Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio. A Republican like Roosevelt, a former Union Army captain who'd fought to end slavery, Foraker saw the Brownsville Affair for what it was: a constitutional atrocity. He was also Roosevelt's political enemy, positioning himself to challenge for the presidency in 1908. But whatever his motives, Foraker became the soldiers' champion. He was meticulous, relentless. The former lawyer dissected every piece of evidence, exposed every contradiction, revealed every unproven assumption. In January 1907, Foraker forced the Senate to authorize an investigation by the Committee on Military Affairs. Sanders became the face of the wronged soldiers. Harper's Weekly put him on their cover in January 1907, head bowed, holding discharge papers, his medals visible, captioned simply, "Dishonorably discharged." On February 11, 1907, Sanders appeared before the Senate committee. His testimony was quiet, devastating. "I'm a poor man. I've served my country honest and faithful. I offered my life to be destroyed for the government, my body to be buried in the earth, and cattle to eat grass off the substance of my blood. And now I am to be cast on the world as a condemned man. Can't you do something for me?" At the Gridiron Dinner on January 27, 1907, Foraker and Roosevelt clashed publicly. The program showed cartoons and verses mocking the attendees. Foraker's read, "All coons look alike to me," suggesting his Brownsville stance was merely to attract black voters. Roosevelt was furious, glaring at his opponent. Then Foraker rose to speak. He tore into Roosevelt's decision, defending Sanders by name, declaring the sergeant as innocent of any offense against the law of any kind whatever as the president himself. Never before had a president been challenged so directly in such a setting. Never before had anyone called Roosevelt out like this to his face. The clash destroyed Foraker politically. Roosevelt turned the party machinery against him. When Foraker ran for re-election in 1908, Roosevelt personally intervened, calling Foraker's re-election nothing less than treason to the party. Foraker lost his Senate seat. His political career was finished. But he never stopped fighting for the Brownsville soldiers. The Senate hearings dragged on for months. In March 1908, the majority report sided with Roosevelt. A minority of 4 Republicans found the evidence inconclusive. Foraker and one other senator filed their own minority report, asserting the soldiers' complete innocence and exposing the contradictory, insufficient, and contrived evidence. In March 1909, Roosevelt signed a bill allowing a board of inquiry to review cases for possible re-enlistment. Of the 167 discharged men, only 76 could be located. 6 didn't wish to appear. The board interviewed about half of them. In the end, they offered re-enlistment to 14 men. 11 accepted. The other 153 remained destroyed. Sanders settled in Washington, D.C. President Taft, who'd succeeded Roosevelt and held his own grudge against the former president, appointed Sanders to federal positions, a pointed reminder of Roosevelt's mistake. But Sanders never recovered what he'd lost. His pension was gone. His rank was gone. His dignity had been publicly shredded. On August 15, 1929, Mingo Sanders died at Freedman's Hospital on the Howard University campus. He was 72 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery beside the other soldiers he'd served with for nearly 3 decades. His wife Luella would join him there in 1942. They were both laid to rest with military honors, despite the dishonorable discharge that had shadowed Sanders' final years. For 66 years, the case remained closed. The soldiers were guilty because Roosevelt said they were guilty. The military investigation was sufficient because the military said it was sufficient. Justice had been served because the government said it had been served. Then, in 1970, historian John D. Weaver published The Brownsville Raid. He'd spent years investigating, tracking down records, interviewing survivors' families. His conclusion was unambiguous. The soldiers were innocent. They'd been denied due process. The evidence against them was planted. They'd been sacrificed to appease a racist Texas town and protect a president's political standing. Weaver's book reached Congressman Augustus Hawkins of Los Angeles. In 1972, Hawkins introduced legislation calling for another Defense Department review. The Army reopened the investigation. Their conclusion matched Weaver's. The soldiers of the 25th Infantry were innocent. The discharge was unjust. On September 28, 1972, 66 years after Roosevelt's order, President Richard Nixon signed a bill granting honorable discharges to all 167 soldiers. For most, it came decades too late. Nearly all were dead. Their lives had been destroyed, their reputations ruined, their families left without the pensions and benefits they'd earned. Only one man lived to see vindication. Dorsey Willis was the youngest soldier discharged in 1906, only 18 years old then, 87 now. In 1973, Congress passed a special act granting Willis a tax-free pension of $25,000. Willis accepted it with grace, but his words carried the weight of 67 wasted years. I'm very grateful. It's a great birthday present, but it comes too many years too late. The Brownsville Affair stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American military history. 167 innocent men were destroyed without trial because a Texas town demanded a scapegoat and a president chose political expediency over justice. First Sergeant Mingo Sanders, the man who'd proven black soldiers' worth on a bicycle across America, who'd saved white soldiers' lives in Cuba, who'd given everything to a country that gave him nothing in return, became the face of that injustice. His testimony before the Senate in 1907 echoes across the decades. I offered my life to be destroyed for the government, my body to be buried in the earth, and cattle to eat grass off the substance of my blood, and now I am to be cast on the world as a condemned man. America took his life. America took his honor. 66 years later, America gave him back a piece of paper saying, "Honorable discharge." It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was the closest thing to justice Mingo Sanders would ever receive.